Ever stop to think about, like, how often Mass is happening around the world? I mean, right now as we're talking, the most sacred thing we do as Catholics is going on in tons of places. It's kind of wild when you really think about it.
It really is. And that's actually what we're going to dig into today.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at how many Masses are celebrated and just the fact that it's constantly going on all over the globe. We've got some estimates from some sources, some really insightful stuff from devotional writings, and also just some attempts to, like, lay it all out logically and see if we can wrap our heads around the numbers behind it.
Yeah. And hopefully for everyone listening, this will give you an even deeper appreciation for the Eucharist and for being a part of the church throughout the world. We'll start with what's happening right now. Then we'll look back through history, and then we'll wrap up by talking about the spiritual meaning of it all.
Sounds good.
So something really interesting to think about is that because the earth is always spinning, the sun is always rising or setting somewhere.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
And as Catholics, what's so cool about that is how it relates to the Eucharist. Malachi prophesied that from the rising of the sun to its setting, my name is great among the nations, and in every place incense is offered to my name, and a pure offering.
Malachi 1:11.
Exactly. And that really points to the idea of a constant offering.
I like that. A constant offering. And it makes me think of this estimate that I saw that between 3 and 5 Masses are being said every second all over the world. Can you imagine? Every second, 3 to 5 times, a priest is lifting up the host, then the chalice.
Wow, when you put it that way.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing.
It is. And theologically, it's not just about how often it happens, but what it represents. The Mass isn't just us remembering what Jesus did. It's making his sacrifice on Calvary present right here and now. So each Mass is that one eternal sacrifice happening again in a new time and place.
It was literally heaven and earth coming together through what the priest does at the altar.
Exactly.
So those elevations that are always happening, it's not just bread and wine being lifted up. It's Jesus offering himself to God for us over and over again all across the world.
Absolutely. So that's kind of a devotional way to think about it, but we can also look at it more concretely. Using some of the numbers we have, there are something like 400,000 Catholic priests worldwide.
Right. And not every priest says Mass every minute of the day, obviously, but it is like the central part of their job. Our sources say that on average, each priest celebrates Mass about 1.2 times per day.
Which makes sense because some priests can celebrate, where there's more than one priest saying Mass together, or sometimes a priest might say more than one Mass in a day.
Right.
So if we multiply those numbers, we get an estimate of around 480,000 Masses being celebrated every day. That's almost 500,000.
Every day. Wow. That's a lot. So to understand how many Masses are happening at the same time, we have to factor in how long a Mass usually is. It seems like the average is around 40 minutes.
Yeah, that seems about right for both weekday Masses and Sunday Masses.
So 480,000 Masses times 40 minutes each. That comes out to a total of 19,200,000 minutes of Mass being celebrated all around the world every day.
Okay, now this is where it gets crazy.
Right. To figure out how many are going on at the same time, we divide that huge number of Mass minutes, 19,200,000, by the number of minutes in a day, which is 1,440.
Okay.
And that means that at any moment, there are about 13,333 Masses taking place all over the planet.
13,000 Masses happening at the same time. That just blows my mind.
I know, me too. It's a lot.
It is.
And in each of those Masses, there are at least 2 elevations, the host and then the chalice. So it's something like 26,666 elevations going on at the same time.
Okay.
And if you consider that Masses last about 40 minutes on average, it comes out to about 11 elevations of Jesus in the Eucharist every single second.
11 times a second, somewhere in the world, Jesus is being lifted up in the Eucharist. It really shows you how constantly connected heaven and earth are through the Mass.
It's amazing. It makes me think about that quote from Padre Pio. He said that it would be easier for the world to exist without the sun than without the Holy Mass. It's a pretty powerful statement.
Yeah, that really makes you stop and think.
Yeah.
I mean, he's saying that the Mass is super important, not just a nice thing to do, but something essential for the world to keep going. He saw it as a way that the grace from Christ's sacrifice is constantly being poured out to us. It helps individual people become holy, and it even keeps the whole world in balance spiritually.
Like those graces from Calvary are always available to us because of the Mass. And they're helping not just our souls, but the whole world spiritually. And, Padre Pio was totally devoted to the Eucharist.
Oh, yeah, he was. He really believed this.
He had all those mystical experiences during Mass.
Right. He was definitely living what he preached. So we've talked about what's going on right now, but it's also incredible to think about how many masses have been celebrated throughout history, since the very first one of the Last Supper.
It's hard to even imagine. Our sources actually tried to estimate it, though.
I know, it's crazy. But we have to remember, this is just an estimate, based on what we know about how much the church has grown and how often masses were celebrated in different times. But the starting point is obviously the Last Supper, which was around 33 AD. So that means we're looking at about 2,000 years of the Eucharist.
Yeah, and over those 2,000 years, the church has gotten a lot bigger. So to estimate the number of masses, they broke it down into periods. Like the early church from 33 AD to 300 AD, when there weren't as many Christians and they were often persecuted, they estimate that about 267 million masses were celebrated during that time.
Which is still a huge number when you think about it.
Right. Then you have the Middle Ages from about 300 AD to 1500 AD. Christendom, it was called back then. The church grew a ton during that time. They estimate that there were something like 30 billion masses celebrated during those years.
30 billion? Wow.
Yeah, a huge jump.
It is.
And then the time after the Reformation, from 1500 AD to 1900 AD. Even with all the changes and divisions in Christianity, the Catholic Church was still spreading around the world. They estimate about 20 billion masses during those years.
Okay.
And finally, the modern era. From 1900 to now, this is when we started keeping better track of things in a lot of places. It's estimated that there have been around 13.1 billion masses celebrated so far.
So if we add up the numbers from each of those periods, it comes out to about 63.4 billion masses celebrated throughout history. Just let that sink in for a minute. 63.4 billion.
That is just an insane number.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that each of those billions of masses isn't a new sacrifice. They're all the same sacrifice of Christ just made present again. So it's like 63.4 billion times that Jesus has offered himself to God through all those priests in all those different places over 2,000 years.
I can't even imagine. It's just incredible.
Like, think about it. All those masses in tiny homes underground when Christians are being persecuted, in giant cathedrals, in modern churches, everywhere.
It's amazing. And that leads us to thinking about what happens in each of those masses. The part where the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ, the consecration.
Yeah, if we're saying there have been about 63.4 billion masses, then there have been at least that many hosts consecrated for the priest to receive communion, and that many chalices of wine consecrated.
Right. But then you have to think about communion for everyone else. Most of the time, there are a lot more hosts consecrated than just the one for the priest.
Right. If we guess that there were about 50 hosts consecrated per Mass on average, and that's probably low because sometimes there are a lot more people receiving communion, but even with that number, you end up with a huge amount of hosts.
63.4 billion masses times 50 hosts per Mass. That's like 3.17 trillion more hosts. I mean, it's almost too big to even understand.
It is. So we're talking about 63.4 billion masses, 63.4 billion hosts for the priest, 63.4 billion chalices of the precious blood, and then a mind-boggling 3.17 trillion hosts for everyone else receiving communion.
Wow. And each and every one of those hosts and chalices is truly Jesus Christ, his body, blood, soul, and divinity.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing when you think about it that way. Christ has come into our world trillions of times. He's entered into the hearts of so many people through communion. And God the Father has received his Son as an offering billions and billions of times.
That's heavy.
It really is. It reminds me of that quote from St. Therese of Lisieux. She said that Jesus does not come down from heaven each day to lie in a golden ciborium. He comes to find another heaven, the heaven of our souls.
That's beautiful. It makes you see how personal and intimate the Eucharist really is.
It does. And this whole conversation, it makes me think about the love behind it all. Like Jesus' words on the cross when he said, I thirst.
Oh, yeah.
John 19.28. After this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said to fulfill the scripture, I thirst.
Such powerful words.
Mother Teresa said that this thirst wasn't just for something to drink. It was a deeper thirst for love for souls, for you and for me.
Wow. I never thought of it like that.
Right. And when we look back at those huge numbers, the billions of masses, the trillions of hosts, the fact that it's happening every second, it tells us something really important. God wants to be close to us. He doesn't want to be far away. He chooses to enter into our world, into our churches, and even into us through the Eucharist.
So he's actively coming to us.
Exactly. And in every Mass, when the priest says those words, this is my body, this is my blood, it's like Jesus is saying, I'm giving myself entirely to you, over and over again. It's a sign of how much he wants to be united with us.
Yeah. And the saints, they've always talked about how amazing this love is. St. Peter Julian Eimard called the Eucharist the supreme proof of the love of Jesus. St. John Vianney said that if we really understood the Mass, we would die of joy. And St. Catherine of Siena said about the Eucharist, "O fire ever burning, the soul cannot live without you."
Wow.
I know.
It's almost hard to believe that God would choose to give himself to us in this way so many times, even when we don't really understand it or love him back the way he deserves.
Yeah, but that's what's so amazing about his love. It's unconditional. And it reminds me of his promises to us. "I'm with you always to the end of the age," Matthew 28:20. "And I will not leave you orphans, I will come to you," John 14:1.
The Mass really shows us that his love is real and he's always with us. So for our listeners who are devout Catholics, this idea of how often the Mass is happening and that it's a continuous offering
Yeah.
might make you think about spiritual communion and praying to be united with all the Masses happening around the world.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to be part of the Eucharist, even if you can't physically be at Mass.
And there's some really beautiful traditional prayers for spiritual communion,
Oh, yeah.
like this one. "O divine Savior, I unite myself with every holy Mass which is celebrated this day throughout the world, outside of which I desire now with greatest longing to receive these spiritually into my heart." Or this one. "O Jesus, I desire to unite my heart with the burning love of thy sacred heart in every Mass being offered now throughout the world." And there are so many good reasons to pray like this. It's a way for people who are sick or can't leave their homes to still be part of the Eucharist. It's a way to offer reparation for sins. And for a lot of people, it's a way to make the Mass the center of their lives, even when they can't physically be there.
And the Church teaches this too. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says that everything in our lives as faithful Catholics, our prayers, our suffering, our work, it's all united with Christ's offering in the Eucharist. CCC 1368.
So even when you're just going about your day, if you offer up your joys and struggles and intentions, you can be united with the sacrifice that's happening on altars all over the world.
That's encouraging.
It is. So to wrap up our deep dive, let's remember what we've learned. We talked about how amazing it is that the Mass is probably being celebrated every single second. Some estimates say 3 to 5 elevations are happening at the same time. And if we look at the numbers more conservatively, it's still around 11 elevations per second.
Okay.
We've journeyed through history and talked about billions of Masses and trillions of consecrated hosts and chalices, all of it showing us how much Christ loves us and how much he wants to be with us.
Yeah, so I guess the question for all of us now is, how does understanding this change the way we participate in the Mass?
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe this deep dive will inspire you to try praying some of those traditional prayers for spiritual communion. Or maybe you'll just take a moment during your day to think about the Mass that's being offered somewhere in the world and unite yourself to it.
And one last thought for you. Every Mass, no matter how small or hidden it may seem, is a moment where heaven and earth are touching. Think about what that means for your life and for the world around you.
That's a good one to ponder.
It